headpiece in so that I can pick up a little bit better audio. And you look like you're in some very tranquil place there.
Yeah, physically it looks like that, but inside my head, you have no idea.
So I'm really excited to have a few minutes with you because as you know, we've been really excited about what you're doing with Matzah at Clover, and I wanted to share that with everybody. And I thought this was a timely moment to do that. I actually just thought of this on Friday. I wish I'd thought of it earlier, but we'll get it out, and I'm sure there's people who would like to try making matzah at home. So we'll talk a little more about technique and stuff later. But do you want to just tell us a little bit about I think it might even be interesting, sort of a very, very short version of like why matzah past Passover. Why are we thinking about this right now? How does it fit in?
Yeah, sure thing. So first of all, thank you so much. It's really inspiring to see, what you're doing and how you're trying to sort of galvanize this moment to connect people to food and making food and food suppliers. And as a sort of fan, I'm really inspired by your work. So I just want to shout that out.
Well, thank you.
And matzah is, by definition, the simplest food. And the origin story of it sort of comes from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible, where the Israelite slaves are leaving Egypt and they don't have enough. They're supposed to leave in haste. The Hebrew word is b'chipazon, and they don't have enough time for the dough to rise on the way out because they're rushing out. And because of that, it doesn't rise, it doesn't leaven. And so there are these flatbreads that they eat called matzot or matzah in Hebrew, as opposed to a leavened bread. And that becomes the emblematic symbol of this holiday. It becomes more dramatic as it gets codified into historical memory. The sort of classic command is for 7 days, you have to eat matzah and only matzah, and no leavened bread, which is called chametz, can be eaten. So it moves from this nice symbol to only matzah for 7 days and no bread for observant Jews. And it's actually the most observed Jewish rituals. 75% of Jews do a Passover Seder with matzah. That's more than any other thing. Even Jewish burial or something like that is more matzah than anything. So it's the popular ritual. What is it? So it technically is one of 5 grains in Jewish law that could leaven but doesn't. And so in our tradition, those are wheat, barley, spelt, oat, some debate about oat among the academics, and rye. And the idea is that it has to be able to become a leavened bread in order to be matzah. And so matzah is the unleavened bread of a bread that could leaven, of wheat, barley, spelt, oat, or rye. What does that mean?
So you mean you can make matzah with any of those grains?
With any of those grains.
Okay.
Or any mixture thereof, and it could be matzah. And the basic sort of thing is that it has to just have water and the flour of that grain. That's all it can have, 2 ingredients. So it's a simple food. And
so not even any salt?
No. So, people will put those things. So this is where it gets complicated in Jewish law a little bit. Because it's called the lechem oni, the bread of affliction. So there are sort of 2 different things. There's like kosher for Passover. So you could have a food that isn't leavened with salt, with onion, with flavor, that's kosher for Passover because it's an unleavened bread and it's got some flavor, and that's fine. But in order to be matzah for the Passover Seder, our ritual commemorating the slavery, it has to be properly impoverished in a sense. It's got to be a bread of poverty. It's got to remind of slavery. So I always like to say it's not really a food. It's like an experiential education of the gastronomic variety. It's like trying to teach you about slavery in your gut. And so for that, you really want something tasteless. So no salt. We even break it in half, so you only have a piece, not a whole loaf. So that's the basics, and it's made in about 18 minutes or less. How we guarantee it doesn't rise with no leavening agent. So that's kind of the.
And so you started making. We're going to give people links and everything to the matzah you've been involved with. What was your inspiration? What made you think to start getting involved with actually making matzah?
Yeah, so it was a twofold. One was I read an article about Bain Capital's purchasing of Manischewitz. Manischewitz, probably the leading American matzah manufacturer, and I think it was a couple of years ago when I read that like a hedge fund was purchasing this religious food product as like another holding in its religious foods portfolio, I wasn't like upset. I just felt like, well, I wonder how this has distorted, like, and then I started getting all these advertisements because I Googled this and was
Yeah.
interested in the story. So I was getting advertisements for like the different flavors and the different varieties. And I realized that I was like being marketed to
Mm-hmm.
as someone who searched for this on Google, like a corporate strategy to sell me more matzah. Thinking the people in the matzah aren't interested in the ritual symbol of the food. They're interested in selling the food, which is fine. I mean, it's America. People are interested in selling food. But what would it look like to be interested not in selling the food, but in empowering this food to do what it does? So that's sort of one part of where it started. Another end of it was that my wife's family, the Horowitz Margaretin family, opened the first matzah bakery in New York in the 1880s. Her great 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 grandfather was the first commercial matzah baker in the U.S. And so there was this sort of like family business element to it, and they're a very tight knit family. They have a historical association. They just had a Zoom reunion. You apply for membership when you marry in. It's like kind of they think a lot of themselves in a good way. They're probably watching this, and so like they deserve to think a lot of themselves. And so there was that element, and then the third piece was the authentic product. So over the millennium, matzah is flattened. So I think most people know it as a cracker.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this burnt, thin, tasteless cracker. But the real matzah, wasn't thin like a cracker. It was dense, maybe even 3 inches thick, just not leavened, which is different than what we eat. And because of the need for it to become shelf stable and not get moldy and to make more profit, my wife's family maybe being culprits, it flattened a fair amount and it hardened so it wouldn't grow mold. You could sell it forever. So I have matzah from 4 years ago that we just opened and we're eating because the store didn't have. So you can't do that with our. We wanted to eat unleavened bread, like the old kind. So it's kind of like the Ezekiel bread of matzah is kind of what we're going for.
Okay.
And it's like the product that would have been before commercialization. So it was an anti-commercialization. And that's how we got there. But then we sort of said, we did this business incubator called Glean with Clal and Columbia University, the business school. Like, what is the job of a matzah? And the job of a matzah is to develop empathy for those who are suffering and to increase freedom from slavery. That's the job. It's not like to make profit for being capital, whoever. It's to increase freedom and eliminate human suffering. So, like, how do we do that in a matzah? So we realized as we were walking through the supermarket, and we saw Newman's own cookies and other brands. We're like, well, the easy way to do it is to redirect the profit from matzah to its cause. So that's when we decided to start a company, really, that would send all profits to charity to fight human trafficking, which is the closest analog to modern slavery. There are between 20 and 40 million people who are enslaved right now. That felt like a really easy analog, right? And we don't see them, but they're in so many industries, about 25 industries in the US, to really help sort of educate about that issue and use this matzah as an educational tool in that way.
And so can people make matzah at home?
Yeah, so this is an interesting debate. Yes, but it's complicated and controversial. So, but why? Why can you and why can't you? So there's this thing called shmora matzah. Our matzah in the factory is shmora matzah. And what that means is it means two things. It's a debate. So nothing's ever simple in Judaism, unfortunately. So it means like explaining it is long. According to one opinion, it means that the matzah is guarded from the time of its harvest not to the flour, the grain, are guarded not to come into contact with water, or if they do come into contact with water, not to split, because sort of sprouting and splitting of the grain starts the leavening process potentially. So it's an extra guarding, and especially as they temper a lot of wheat in different ways commercially, so you're looking for wheat that either isn't tempered, or if it's been tempered, has been guarded not to sort of split, or you're looking for flour once it's ground that hasn't been treated with some kind of water. And so you have to sort of work in particular ways. That's one opinion. But there's another opinion. You don't have to worry about that, that it just has to be intentional. So the people making it have to declare, I'm making this matzah to make matzah. Now, other stuff could be kosher for Passover, but it might not be matzah for the Seder. It might not fit this sort of intentional sort of debate. So our factory checks all the boxes, kind of, but But yeah, so the answer is if you're just trying to eat food on Passover, you can
Yeah.
make your own matzah. But if you can find one that isn't, you know, temper treated or other things, um, that'll be better.
Okay. And so,
It's really simple. It's really easy
yeah,
by definition because it's a simple food.
yeah, it's water and it's flour. And then is it cooked?
Yeah. So the way it's made is you need the water and the flour. I would say usually like about 4 cups of flour or like 600 grams, something like that. And like maybe 390, 400 grams of water will usually get you a 400 milliliters of water, depending on, you know, obviously depends on your humidity, depends on your flour. But if you're using a whole wheat flour, usually find about 600 grams to like 390 milliliters of water will get you a good mixture. And you can see the instructional video and you just knead it. And the tradition is the more kneading, the better, because you don't want it to rise. And so our tradition is that the more you, it's not a, it's just true. The more you work the matzah, the flour, the less likely it will rise. So constant working and kind of like working it hard. And you roll it out traditionally round with a rolling pin and you bake it. And the whole process is 18 minutes. So you put an 18-minute timer up. And from the time water hits your flour, it's got to be out of the oven in 18 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's like a really quick process by design because it's just like the Israelites left in haste, the matzah has to be made in haste. So it's an 18-minute thing. You can't go longer.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You know, I think metaphorically too, for us to think of at this time and sort of making do with what you have and getting the most out of the thing you have. But it when you make it this way, it doesn't taste great, right? So it's sort of different than a lot of our food experiences that way, right?
Right. So here's the interesting thing, right? Like people are looking for matzah, and even like our, you know, we get customer feedback, and it's interesting when you're trying to get customer feedback for a food that's designed to taste not good.
Yeah.
And so we approached a local bagel baker who we love, Milena Pagan at Rebel Bagels. Maybe she's listening to this. She had all these great tips about like using a tortilla press and how it could be like better. And I get that, right? You like want to make it better, but then the inner sort of instinct for us is like, actually, it's the bread of affliction. It's like a bad Jewish comedy, right? We want this like to taste bad. So we were dealing with this interesting thing of trying to develop a better bread that's dense and like the food slaves would have eaten. So by using a great flour, like we work with Main Grains, who have been phenomenal partners with an incredible product, but by using a great flour, by making a thicker product that's fresher, we have like a tastier grain and a denser matzah that when warmed is like heavier going down. There's a mindful eating experience to the matzah that's richer with our matzah, but I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a pleasant one.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting how, you know, even just as you describe the different rules and, you know, approaches, you know, it's an interesting thing, I think, in a bigger reflection on our food system. There's like strong adherence to this idea, you know, even to the point of like, is it going to sprout or is it going to get wet? But then at the same time, the matzah that everyone eats, I guess 99% of the matzah people eat is like white flour, which is, you know, a teeny fraction of what's in a wheat berry, right? So there's like the strong adherence in certain areas, but then, you know, walking way away from what the historic product would have been in other areas, right?
Well, so I mean, and that gets deeper, which is sort of why we named our company Mitzvah Matzahs, which is sort of a play on the mitzvah, good deed, commandment, right? Doing a nice thing. We're sending our money to charity, but also before you make it, you have to declare we're making this as for the sake of matzah. It's an intentional food product. So reflecting on the idea that in the matzah factories, someone flips the switch on a machine once a year and says that, and this whole machine goes and it becomes $1 billion industry where, right, like folks are sort of basically just making a lot of money off the profit margin. And some of that is sort of, I don't want to say gouging, but like, because we're charging high prices and just turning the profit around, we're not charging cheaper. But like, what does it mean to say this is an intentional food product and then it's really about profit in a corporate system? You know, like in what sense, it's sort of the same thing. Well, in what sense is it intentional? Because is just declaring it so, does that make this a spiritually intentional food? Or is there something much deeper about the whole thing, right? Can you use a non-organic wheat that has pesticides that is sort of contributing to ecological collapse or disaster, and then say, well, this is matzah that's creating freedom? Like, is it, or is it killing us all? So, right, like, what's it doing to our gut?
And so, what's your favorite? So, away from the more serious specifics of matzah, but what's your favorite way to eat matzah at home?
Yeah, so this is really this has been a challenge this year. Now, my favorite way is matzah pizza, and this is just breaking from everything, right? And I think this is a classic. And I will say that in that sense, like, that's what our matzah is best for, because it's soft as opposed to hard. People say it's like a pita. It's not, because it's dense, so it's not like a pita at all. But it is soft, and it makes a great pizza dough. So a lot of people really like that. But our daughter, we found, is allergic to dairy, so we're not having any dairy in the house. And so my favorite use of our matzah, of matzah in general, is just to slather it in some tomato sauce, like mozzarella cheese, maybe some Parmesan and Italian seasoning, and just sort of like bake it. And that, I would say, is my favorite use of it. But this year, I mean, I could do it, but my wife isn't doing it. She's feeding our baby, and I'm trying to keep it out. So in solidarity, I'm giving up my favorite use of our matzah. But that would definitely be the favorite.
Okay, that's fun. I love with scrambled eggs. I think that's like definitely something I love.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's like brie, they often call it, a matzah brie, and that you would sort of soak in eggs, almost like a French toast.
Yeah.
Our daughter's also allergic to eggs.
Oh, okay.
This is killing me. These are my two favorite uses. So yesterday, I tried so hard to make it with quinoa flakes as a substitute for the eggs, and it was like passable, but not
Is
doing it.
she lactose intolerant or a
She's
different
allergic?
Actually, an allergy. Yeah.
An actual allergy.
Oh, that's tough.
But those are two great uses.
Just Egg has a product that's like a fake egg product. I wonder if that might work for you.
I wonder if that would be better. Yeah.
Yeah, you can check it out. I don't know about cheese. All the fake cheeses, unfortunately, don't taste good in my mind right now. But someday we'll get some good fake cheese.
Yeah, there is only one that I found decent, which is a Barrett's Garden Parmesan, a fake Parmesan.
I haven't tried it. Okay.
But I've tried them all, and most of them, like, I'm never buying again.
Yeah.
But this Parmesan, we actually just bought from like a distributor in bulk, because it's pretty good.
Wow. All right.
Cashew and nutritional yeast.
Good thing to hear about. Well, thank you again for taking some time. I think this is really interesting for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people as well. And I'm hoping people give it a try and make some matzah at home. I know we'll try and do that sometime in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I will say there's nothing like sort of a hands-on cooking experience to sort of really, really do it. And matzah, I'm not a baker, I'm a rabbi. And the thought that I'd be like operating a food company is crazy to me. But anyone, if I can do this, anyone can do this.
Well, which is true about food, right? And I think that I'm encouraging people to not be afraid to make mistakes, because we learn that way. And most mistakes in the kitchen taste pretty good, and a few of them don't, but that's okay too. And maybe if you're doing the matzah right, it doesn't taste good either.
But, you sure you don't even need it to taste good? And also, kneading dough hard, I'm going to say, and probably people could use this, I find to be a really good stress relief.
All right. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we'll share the video of how to make it as well. Thank you for your time. That was really awesome.
Thank you. Okay, and we're live here, Baking with Barry. We're doing matzah for Jewish Live. Credit to Naomi Bain, my wife and co-founder of our venture, Mitzvah Matzahs, for getting this set up. It's like running a cooking show. So we're going to be making matzah today. Many people have become disempowered and think that you have to buy matzah in a box. That isn't so. One disclaimer, religious disclaimer, there are a lot of different opinions about what flour you can or can't use to make matzah, and that's because the flour might have been sprayed with water or other substances and hasn't necessarily been guarded from moisture. There's something called shmora matzah, means guarded. The Torah in Exodus says, Ushmartem et hamatzot, and you should guard the matzah. And that means different things. There's debates in the sages. We don't have to get into all of it now. Some say it means you should guard the matzah from the harvest. Others say it means you should guard the matzah to make sure the flour hasn't contacted water from the time of kneading. And others say it means that it just has to be intentional. You have to declare that you're making matzah as opposed to chancing on an unleavened bread. So all of that's a sort of way of background. I'm not here to opine about that, other than to say that according to most opinions, certainly in an odd situation or unusual circumstance, you can use this matzah and just make sure that from the time of kneading, it's okay. The matzah we use in the mitzvah matzah's factory is shmora flour. It's guarded from the time of the harvest. Okay, that's the disclaimer. So we're going to be making matzah. Pretty straightforward. The first thing you're going to want to do is declare that you're doing it for the intention of making matzah. This is an intentional food item. So there's a sort of religious practice to making this food, and that's by saying the three words, l'shem matzot mitzvah. That's l'shem matzot mitzvah, or l'shem matzah's mitzvah in the Ashkenazis, and that is for the sake of the mitzvah, the commandment of making matzah. Now, this is a different flour than we've used in our factory, so I'm not sure exactly how it's going to come out, but we've weighed out here about 600 grams or 4 cups of flour. You can see there. And we're using today a King Arthur organic white whole wheat flour. Again, not what we use in our matzah factory, but that's what I've got in my house today. And that might be more similar to what you're going to have. You're not going to have a guarded whole wheat matzah from whole wheat flour from Maine. And so there's about 4 cups of that, 600 grams. And I have here about just under 400 milliliters of water. Another caveat or disclaimer. There's something called mayim shalanu, water that's rested. When they used to get well water, there was a concern it would be heated from the sun or other things, and so it would cause the matzah to rise. And so there was a custom to leave the water out overnight. But according to almost all modern authorities, if you're working with cold, cool tap water, it's not an issue. So you want to be working with the cool water, though. That's the tradition. Now, a few rules, and then we'll get at it. And it's really simple. First rule, it is the bread of affliction. 2 ingredients, water and flour. That's it. That's all we've got going on here. Second rule, 18 minutes from the time that the water hits the flour. We have 18 minutes to get this matzah out of the oven. Third rule, you're going to be wanting to knead the matzah, the flour, the dough, vigorously the whole time. The ideal is to constantly be kneading and to never let it rest. If you're doing multiple batches, you're going to want to clean your equipment to make sure there's no leftover dough. And so that's part of it. And you're also going to want to set an 18-minute timer or have a time-telling device around to get your matzah out of the oven on time. Things you'll need: a mixing bowl, water. A rolling pin could come in handy. You may or may not want a surface of some kind. You could use the counter if you're a kind of sticky baking surface, and a docker. There are fancy metal ones. This is from an online kit to start your own pizza shop. And this puts holes in the matzah, and that prevents air pockets and air bubbles from developing. Also, it's extremely therapeutic. We're back. That was my wife from the other room reminding me that most people do not have a docker. I'm going to insist you're going to want to get one of these medieval torture devices. It is extremely therapeutic and a healthy way to take out your aggression. But if you do not have a docker, a fork will do just fine. So you can take a fork and poke holes in your matzah. But get yourself a docker, you won't regret it. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to go. We've heated our oven here to 550. Now we're making a soft matzah. Some people think this is the Sephardic style matzah, and you can see our website for more about that, or interview on Judaism Unbound. It doesn't have to be that hot. I would recommend heating your oven up to the highest temperature it'll get to, and putting the baking sheet that you're going to use, we're using just a cookie tray there, in to let it get hot. Okay? So you'll pour the water in. say L'Shem Matzot Mitzvah, and from that time you have 18 minutes to go. You want to knead and see how what the consistency is, and knead vigorously. You just want to keep kneading this until all of the water gets incorporated. And you can judge based on the humidity of the flour, your particular circumstances, if your dough is too dry or too wet. But again, this looks like it's okay for us today. We're using, here again, I got about 600 grams of flour and about 400 milliliters of water. And the harder you work matzah, the better that's going to be. Just come here and get in the video. You can see there, but we've kind of turning it into a dough. We'll see how many this will make, but I would think this will make about six or so 7-inch matzahs. You can make fewer, smaller matzahs, but 6 will be enough for 2 seders. A note while we're doing this about challah, some people have the custom to take an amount out in remembrance of an offering that used to be given to the priest, the Kohen. That only happens with a minimum amount, according to classic Jewish law. Maybe it's about 12 cups of flour, maybe 16. So we're not at enough of that here to make the blessing. We've got a beautiful dough here. This is right on. So that ratio that I suggested will work well with, maybe it's a little wet, but you see that's a nice dough. Then you want to knead it. The more kneading, the better it's going to be. And you want to give it a vigorous, it's a good rule of thumb. Let's give it about 25 or 30 solid kneads until it becomes a little more Play-Doh-like, like some kind of putty. Now, I'm not a baker. I've never successfully baked a loaf of bread. Matzah is foolproof. Anyone can do it. This here is a little wet, so in an ideal world, we might have floured our surface in advance. We didn't do that. Now my hands are a little sticky, but if you're at home, you'll probably want to have a little flour on your tabletop surface. It'll make it easier when you roll the matzah out. Now, one of the reasons why we bake a soft matzah at a slightly lower temperature than a traditional cracker matzah is that in a cracker matzah, if you use that high temperature, it cooks all the way through. It's very thin, but in a soft matzah, you'll sear the outside, but the inside won't fully cook. So you want to cook at a little bit of a lower temperature so that it cooks evenly through. The ideal, if you have it, most people do not, is to have a perforated pan. I don't know if you can see, but I'm rolling this into like a log now. I've got a nice dough so that I can cut it into even pieces. You might use a knife. To do that, if you have a cutter, but if not, plain old knife. What you want to do maybe is make yourself from these 2 logs of 2, and out of each of those 3, so you'll have 6 total. Split it twice, once into 2 and once into 3. You can be as exact or imperfect as you like, depending on your personality, need for perfection. Okay. Then you're going to take your rolling pin, move the bowl out of the way. you're going to take one of these and flatten it out a bit. Now, I'm not using the ideal rolling pin here. We're working from our home kitchen, not our factory. The ideal is to use, I think, what they call the French rolling pins. They kind of are gradated with a slope out, but this will do the trick. Get a nice round circle going. A beautiful matzah, maybe there, maybe this is about 1/3 of an inch thick, 1/4 of an inch thick. See that nice matzah? This will make a great matzah pizza. Have fun with the shape. Then you want to take your docker and just give some holes in each side. Again, the more holes, the better, the fewer the air pockets. And now you see we'll have a matzah with holes. There, just put that to the side. And you'll do that with each of your matzahs. Now, in addition to making them in the 18 minutes, it's important that you look for signs of leavening, sort of cracks in the dough or other things that suggest that it has risen. If you've done this correctly, it won't rise at all. There'll be no signs. I would say that's likely what's going to happen. But if your matzah does, on the off chance that it rises, obviously it's not matzah, it's leavened bread. So try again. This is a great activity for the family. Also to get kids involved. Kids love to work with dough. Their hands a little messy. It's a good way to re-empower people. A lot of people make their own challah for Shabbat. For some reason, people think they can't do matzah. They've been taught that it's fraught. It used to be in Europe and in other places, every community would make their own matzah. Okay, so we've got 3 pretty beautiful matzahs there, if I don't say so myself. Now, you don't want any loose flour on them or anything like that, because that might not really cook. So you want to avoid having sort of tons of flour. So you don't want it to be too wet, not too dry. It's kind of a fine balance. But again, this 600 to 400 ratio seems to work pretty well for many kinds of flour. A little bit smaller. Got just 2 left. Just a note while I'm doing this about why it is that matzah became flat and cracker-like. There are kind of 2 reasons. One was the 1880s, 90s, the Manischewitz factory and the Horowitz Margaretin factory. Horowitz was in New York and Manischewitz in Cincinnati got going. And they started making machine matzah, which a lot of people are used to, as opposed to handmade matzah. They wanted those to be shelf stable, not to go moldy or bad like bread. So they started making them cracker-like, and then it was a big controversy at the time, especially because, as you see, it has to be an intentional project. So the question arose, is it sufficient to have the operator of the machine have intention, l'shem matzah mitzvah, that it's for the sake of matzah, or do you really need a handmade product? Still, many of the Hasidic groups insist on handmade matzah, but most other people have come to rely on the machines. But there's no replacement for making it like by hand. The other reason for the flattening of matzah was to make it less likely to rise, a sort of legal stringency. So two things turned the bread of affliction into the cracker of affliction. You can see these are, still thin, still flat, very dense. Sometimes people say they're like pita, but they're really not. Denser than that. Then you want to take your baking tray out and get your matzahs on. Lay them on kind of flat. I'm only going to fit about 4 on here. I see. Got those in. Maybe I'll get another tray to finish the final 2. See that there? And of course, you want to check to see how much time is left on your 18 minutes. And you'll probably want these to be in the oven, until fully cooked, but not until overcooked, for about between 4 and 8 minutes, depending on the size and temperature of your oven. So we'll see you when they're ready. And we're back. Just taking the matzah out of the oven now. And I see these here. They got a nice golden brown to them. And something you might want to do, just to make sure they're done, you don't want them to be raw, wet. You might want to stick a toothpick in, make sure it comes out clean, that it's cooked, and you kind of see inside. If you're not sure, you can cut one open to test, but you want them not to be raw anymore. And you're also going to want to flip them when you take them out so they don't condense. Maybe move them around and let them cool somewhere with good ventilation. They can get kind of soggy in the cooling procedure. Let's take the last batch out of the oven. Also looking good. Those a little more charred on the other end. As you can see, they got a little sort of golden brown to them, and that's basically making matzah. If you can work with a perforated pan, that'll be even better. So this concludes our initial run of Baking with Barry. Thanks for joining. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot an email over to info@mitzvahmatzos.org. That's mitzvahmatzos.org. And we'll do our best in this crazy time to help you out. But good luck if you don't have matzah or just decide you want to bake your own this year. Good luck baking matzah.